Go to my guest, though. I am joined with the one and only the man of the hour coming into the new year, KJ No. He's a journalist, political analyst, writer, and teacher specializing in the geopolitics of the Asia Pacific region. He is a contributor to the book Capitalism on a Ventilator, once censored by Amazon. It is now available at iacentric.org. KJ, man, Happy New Year, Merry Christmas. Welcome to the show. How you doing today? You doing all right?
I'm doing well. Merry Christmas and Happy New Year to you too.
Thanks, man. So I saw a few things coming out of China recently that makes me very jealous. One was a sixth generation jet that apparently can fly into space, which is just astonishing by itself, right? The other one was a warship that was apparently the most sophisticated warship in the Chinese arsenal that just went out to land. I think it looked like an aircraft carrier, but it wasn't an aircraft carrier. It was some kind of amphibious assault ship, but the thing was magnificent in regards to a war setting. And I even saw this high-speed train that goes 450 kilometers an hour. And I stuck to myself, we are $36 trillion in debt. Why don't we have those things? Which made me a bit jealous and a bit angry at my government for not investing in those things, as opposed to wasting $10 trillion in issues of war. Somebody in the US apparently came out and said that the reason that China is inviting an arms race by presenting the sixth generation fighter, and apparently even by definition of warship that they release, is China trying to get an arms race going, KJ. Why else would they put out the sixth generation fighter for the world to see if indeed they weren't trying to get the US into some kind of arms race? What's going on?
I think there's some signaling going on, and I think they're telling the United States, we are capable of defending ourselves, so don't get any ideas. We already know that China has a significant missile defense capacity. Those are the Dongfeng that they have been developing for nearly 2 decades now, and that gives them a very powerful way of creating standoff defense capacities. And now with these new stealth fighters and possibly bombers, they're showing that they also have power projection capacities. Right now, all of this stuff is very speculative. People are just going off of pictures that they have seen. There are no stats that have been released. It's all kind of speculation at this point. But what the message is that China is technologically capable of building weapons to defend itself, just as it is capable of building infrastructure to develop its own country and create public wealth. Another thing that's interesting is that many of these companies are actually public companies that do public construction. And then kind of as a side benefit, they're also capable of doing military construction and military contracting, which is very different from the United States, where you have dedicated military companies. And so I would say that this is more kind of like a spin-off or of a side effect of China's overall economic and technological development, rather than any specific direct, challenge to the United States as far as an arms race is concerned.
Are you concerned that, let me give you an example from the American context. Before the Second World War, the US was somewhat of an isolationist nation, especially by standards that we have today. And when we were looking at the war, FDR had to do a lot to gin up American sentiment, to get involved in that Second World War where he would have public support to do so. Pearl Harbor was a galvanizing force in doing that. And the moment that we went into that Second World War, all of the industry, everything else ramped up. And at that point, it was hard to put the genie back into the bottle, especially when people were making so much money on issues of weapons, war, etc. Is there any concern that China will go that route? Like that in this fight of sorts for survival in regards to the pressure that the US is applying to China, trying to do to China what he did to Russia, using Taiwan as a battering ram to go after China. Taiwan is part of China, despite the fact they're dumping all the weapons in the world into Taiwan. Is China concerned, or are there concerns that that same, let's say, device that kicked in after the Second World War, where the United States went into that, okay, now we're a global policeman, or at the very least, we are looking outward of the United States and projecting military force and military power. China clearly has industry where they can do it. I mean, you have 3 times our population, and we've sold a lot of our industry off for things like services and those type of things. Is there any concern that China may go that route? Or you still believe that for all intents and purposes, China has a win-win ideology, and in the context of that win-win ideology is not looking for any notion of hegemony? Give me your thoughts.
Yeah, well, I think we have to go back and look at the historical record. China has been around for a long time. So there's a long track record that you can look at. And China does not have a history of engaging in imperialist ventures. It doesn't colonize other countries. There's a kind of natural boundary to which China conforms to inside the Asian continent. When it reaches those boundaries, it simply stops. It does not have an expansionist history. Now, people like to say, oh, what about, Taiwan? Well, Taiwan is China. They say, what about, Tibet, etc. These are all parts of China. So you can't argue that simply that because there was, internal dissent inside China itself, that this was some kind of expansionist agenda. There was a war with Vietnam in 1979. That was the last war that China fought. And before that, there was the Korean War, and it was a participant in the Vietnam War. 1979, that war, which is probably the last, major military engagement that China had, lasted less than 4 weeks. It was a kind of a punitive attack because Vietnam had attacked Cambodia and was actually colonizing Cambodia. So the Chinese did kind of a diversionary attack. The Vietnamese had to distract or reallocate their troops back to the border near China. And then that created, kind of a balancing effect. And it didn't lead to, the complete overrunning of Cambodia. And so I would say that, at least from the historical standpoint, China does not have an expansionist militarist agenda. And then certainly, once again, you can see in its position papers and what it's doing, as well as the historical record, it simply wants to trade with other countries. And it believes that trade is a win-win proposition, and that you can actually create safety for your country by having good relations with other countries rather than trying to dominate them, which is the US and Western model. The US Western model is very clear. It's an imperialist project, and it's something that's driven by the internal contradictions of its own economy. The economies expand, they go monopolist, they become financialized in order to maintain the system that itself exists. They have to expand. It's this constant prerogative to expand, which is both capitalist and imperialist. China is not functioning from that standpoint, and therefore it doesn't have that same imperial colonialist expansionist logic. People who assert that either don't really understand the history and the mechanics of that system, or they're deliberately spouting propaganda.
I'm curious, from your point, what are you expecting from the new year in regards to China and this kind of, let's say, the global order? It seems that various countries, especially this kind of multipolarity, is only increasing and only expanding. And that seems to be, I would say, a diminishment of Europe. I mean, the US seems to be eating Europe alive with policy, basically deindustrializing Europe, leaving the United States kind of this kind of defender of Western ideology with Europe as a vassal in this case. But in the way that China is looking out at the world as they project the world out into the next 5 years or 10 years, what are they looking at? What are they trying to accomplish just as a country itself and the way it fits within the global order? I know that's somewhat of an expansive question, but I am curious on your take. It's basically, I guess, the Chinese outlook on the world.
Well, there are no secrets here. The Chinese have, planned and mapped this out. These are public documents. They have the Global Security Initiative, the Global Civilizational Initiative, a series of global initiatives. They have to do with expanding trade, expanding win-win relations with other countries. They have, a way of building out a multilateral system where countries are equal, but that they have a duty to each other towards peace and towards mutual security. So, based on the United Nations and as well as the Bandung principles, they're essentially saying this is the world we envisage, a world of equals where every country fits and works together in a multilateral system based on peace and mutual win-win relations. That's what they want. What do I, expect over the next years? Certainly, there will be an increased push towards multipolarity. More and more countries will join the BRICS, the SCO, the BRI, etc. I think that Europe will continue to circle the drain, and it will continue to become worse and worse. I think we will see a complete breakdown of what is called the rules-based international order and the fraudulent narratives around democracy behind that. So, for example, already you see, they've given up on any notion that they're really fighting for democracy. You think of like Bulgaria, think about Romania, Georgia, France, and South Korea now. I mean, all of them have essentially given up, any meaningful pretense that there's some kind of, democratic system. I mean, South Korea is fighting hard, still trying to maintain some measure of stability. But, the empire, as it loses its centrifugal power, is simply resorting to brute force. And we see this as a long progression. It's, this has been coming a long time, starting with Iraq. It's this kind of naked power move, this naked reversion to primitive accumulation that you see in the imperial core when it can no longer coerce its vassals in the, subtle ways that it is accustomed to. It's the resort to brute force and military power, and to the naked violation of these quote unquote rules and order that it has pretextually propagated with no foundation.
Was it always coercion though? I mean, I get the sense that at one point it was, even in the US context, a win, lesser win. I guess when the economics of the United States kind of allowed it, when Europe and everything else had been demolished by the war. I mean, or was it always coercion in some way? I'm curious. It's a weird question to ask, but from my point of view, I get the sense that our system has gotten worse and worse over time. And part of the reason why I pointed out what China was building in regards to the aircraft or the sea craft, or for that matter, for God's sake, China was talking about putting a base on the moon. And the US at one point had those ideas. I mean, the John F. Kennedy speech about freedom in space. Yes, I know that speech was talking about fighting the Soviets, fair enough. But that is an expansive speech. I mean, Kennedy pointed out we're going to the moon, and within 10 years, we were on the moon. That is pretty astonishing of a feat. And those big things are not necessarily things that we're doing anymore. Those things are things that China is in many respects are doing. I guess my question becomes, why do you think that's changed? What has been, what is the difference? Why do you think that the political system has degraded in some respects? And for that matter, the expectation of even the population, or the expectation of what this country can do, given the industrial and economic potential of the United States. From your take, why has it degraded in such a way, whereas China, not so much? They seem to be on the ascendant.
Well, there are different theories about this. I don't claim to have any special authority to, interpret what happened. One has to do with the failure or the fall or the demise, the destruction of the USSR. When that happened, some people said, well, this signaled the end of history. It was the failure of communism and the USSR. And other people say it was actually a mutual failure. both systems failed. It's just one of them didn't realize it. US system was already failing as well. And we see that, it's just been a little bit slower in its, manifestation. But you understand that, the US is a capitalist society. Capitalist societies have markets. When you have neoliberal markets, which is to say that they're markets that have no restraints, what happens inside those markets is that you get massive monopolies. The companies, corporations become enormous, and then they take over entire sectors of the of the field itself. So this is, this is how capitalism trends towards monopoly. Once you have monopoly, you have what, pardon my French, inshitification. The companies that are monopolies, they gouge everything they can. They deliver fewer and fewer services, poorer and poorer goods, and they exert enormous power against any kind of control. And at the same time, they're constantly immiserating the population. And so then eventually what you have is you have a population, the vast majority, who are incredibly impoverished. You have a government that is captured by corporations, and then you have corporations that funnel large amounts of money simply to the top. So you have the Jeff Bezoses and the Elon Musks, who have monopoly corporations in their fields. And then once you have this, then because there's no reasonable way of generating value, these corporations trend towards a financialization. So they move into the financial field, and essentially they're looking for ways to gouge money out of people that don't have it. It's a kind of rentier economy. Michael Hudson, has spelled this out in clear detail. But so, for example, you have a company like GM, which at one point was making more money off of car loans than it was from actually building cars. You have companies like Apple or, some of the tech companies, they're not really building meaningful technological products. Essentially, they are PR companies and law firms that sue each other. And then they have a small IT department, that sells, crappy products, that they're forcing people to upgrade constantly. Mm-hmm. We see inshitification across the board, Microsoft, Amazon, none of these corporations are accountable. They're simply gouging and destroying the markets that they're supposed to be, quote unquote, serving or monopolizing. And then that is going to result in, on the one hand, you need the kind of continuous imperial expansion based on financialization in order to simply keep the system running. And on the other hand, you see the constant immiseration and the human suffering that is increased. So, from the 1970s, the bottom 50% have not seen an increase in their salaries since the 1970s. It's essentially salaries have flatlined since the 70s. And on the other hand, you have countless billionaires constantly being creative. And under those circumstances, then what you have is a carceral state. You understand that with that kind of neoliberalism, you have to come down really, really hard. You securitize, the state. You have a 700% increase in incarceration since the 1970s. You have the implementation of police forces that are essentially colonial occupying forces. They're militarized forces that occupy communities. And then you have captured legislature and captured political class that essentially is simply feeding this national security state and this corporatized winner takes all system. Under that structure, you are not going to get a decent society that does anything that we expect of a normal, well-functioning state. Instead, you're going to get simply structural violence compounded by structural violence, compounded by repression and oppression and surveillance. And then that will also lead into a kind of global, a global
Malaise. Yeah.
malaise. So,
I.
and to say
Oh
China
no,
isn't
please.
doing this, right? It's not doing this. It doesn't allow corporate monopolies. It disciplines
Mhm.
the corporate class. It plans ahead. Markets, to the extent that they have large companies, these are government-controlled companies. The largest financial corporations on the planet. In the US, the largest financial corporations are all private banks and private equity firms. In the US, the largest banks are essentially state-controlled. They're public goods. They're like the water company, the electricity
Yeah.
company. Their job is to provide a public good of financing. It's a completely different system. And we can see that one system is working. It's working for its people. That's why 90% of the people in China, according to US surveys, trust their government and believe that, that the future is bright. And in the United States, we know that something is seriously wrong. When
Yeah.
70% of the population is living hand to mouth, paycheck to paycheck, and vast numbers of people who are even working full-time, jobs are homeless, that there's something deeply and fundamentally wrong.
Yeah. Agreed. There was a homelessness stat that came out where homelessness increased by 18% in 2024 under Joe Biden. And the year before that, it increased, I believe, 14% or 12%, I believe, which means you're getting these marked increases in the amount of people who are literally living on the streets in one of the richest countries on the planet. It is outrageous. It should not be accepted. I agree with you. Like, I don't think anybody in the United States, or most people that you talk to, don't believe that the government is working on the interests of those people in America. And I know some Americans think that, well, the people in China are robots. That's where they go with 90%. That's not really the case. They just believe that the government is competent in the way the government is acting, in a way that the government is not competent here. I agree with you wholeheartedly, KJ. The Baltic Sea. Let's talk about the Baltic Sea. So NATO is saying that they're now going to militarize the Baltic Sea because apparently cables have been cut. And in one sense, they're blaming China, saying that China is working in association with Russia. And in another sense, they're blaming Russia, saying that these two countries are working in tandem to destroy the property, apparently, of NATO or these European countries. Give me a take on that. Is this just, a problem looking for a solution where they're looking to militarize this area anyway? And so they come up with an excuse to do so. I mean, what's the evidence that this has been cut? I guess will be my first question. But more to the point, give me your take on this. Is China going around cutting cables that belong to Europe in some kind of, I don't know what this is supposed to be, some kind of terrorism that China is working in tandem with Russia and committing? Give me your thoughts.
Well, anything that China is doing or is alleged to have done is supposed to be bad. And there's never any proof of this, right? Nobody has given any meaningful proof. They're simply allegations. They're trying to see if they can throw something against the wall, see if something sticks. I mean, Chinese garlic is supposed to be, a plot to destroy America. It's cultivated by slaves. And then it's designed to, kill off Americans, right? Everything. Your toaster is spying on you. They're listening on you with, weather balloons, right? I mean, the Chinese if the Chinese are listening on you with weather balloons, the Chinese have thousands of satellites in low Earth orbit to assert that they need to send a large, visible, non-steerable object over the United States in order to surveil the United States is like saying, the National Security Agency is spying on you with a tin can and, a string that's, drilled into your wall. It's just absurd. This is 17th century technology. The Chinese are not using 17th century technology to surveil you. So in my standpoint, I think it is all absurd. I mean, I will change my mind if I see evidence, but the fact is there is no evidence. Show the evidence, okay? Until then, we can assume that this is part of a large and continuous propaganda offensive. But speaking of that area, it is already highly militarized. So for them to say that they're going to militarize it, this is, it's like after the fact justification. It's already being militarized. It's already highly surveilled. And if nothing else, I think that, I would be worried not so much about quote unquote cables being cut. I mean, what happened to Nord Stream, right? I
Right.
think there's some questions to answer about that. So I think that this is more propaganda. It fits into the trope that, China and Russia and Iran and North Korea are, an axis of evil, of doing bad things. And, let's just throw out some absurd lies and see how many people, take them up on it. So
Is China concerned about the Uyghurs? And let me explain why I asked that. When Syria was knocked over, when the government of Syria fell, many of the people who helped overthrow Syria was not Syrians, like meaning they came from other parts, extremists, terrorists, came from other parts of other countries in order to basically invade and overthrow that government, regardless of whether they thought they could do it in the beginning. They overthrew the Syrian government. The Uyghurs that were there were effectively saying, we have to overthrow this government, and now we're going back to China, and China's next. And I saw that video, and I thought to myself, I heard a speaker, I can't remember the guy, I think he was Chinese, but he was making this argument that, China had to deal with a terrorism issue. And the terrorism issue was just so happened taking place in that region. And that the moment that they tried to change those people's mind, meaning denazify the terrorists in this case, that the U.S. starts howling that they're somehow doing something to the Uyghurs, that they're committing some kind of genocide to the Uyghurs. Now, nobody has proven this at all. And this has just been something that they've been outing because people have been throwing the label that the U.S. has been literally backing a genocide in Gaza that everybody with their own eyes can see. Meaning in the China case, you have to take our word for it. In the American case, you could see it with your own eyes. You see what they're doing. You see the depravity that our tax dollars are paying for. And so when I saw the Uyghurs effectively saying, well, we're going back to China after literally overthrowing a government and killing Christians or people who didn't necessarily follow their belief, Alawites, etc., it made me think, I guess that guy was right. What is China thinking about this? I mean, I would imagine they have to be paying attention to the Syria conflict, especially considering some of their citizens are involved in overthrowing the government. Is there any concern that those terrorists are coming back to China? Give me your thoughts on this. This was one of the questions I wanted to ask, and I forgot to ask last time. Give me your thoughts.
Yeah, well, I think you're absolutely right. First, there is quote unquote no genocide of the Uyghurs in China. Their population has grown sixfold, and their life expectancy has grown 250%. Those are not the numbers that you get when you have a genocide. The Uyghurs in Xinjiang were exempt from the one-child policy. How many children does Xi Jinping have? He has one child. He was held to the one-child policy like everybody else, like they held all of their leaders. There are no exceptions. And on the other hand, the Uyghurs, being an ethnic minority, were allowed to have 2, 3, sometimes more children, which is why their birth rate is twice the level of the Han majority, and why their population has grown sixfold. So these are just extraordinary mendacities. And they come out of, the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, which is a deep state think tank designed to undermine China. They come out of the words of Adrian Zantz, who was then featured prominently in all the Western media, in particular the BBC. And then he, trickled down into, quote unquote, the left, the left media as well. Amy Goodman gave him, several interviews asking a question about this guy he's like a cotton mather from the 17th century. I mean, he believes that Jews and gays are going to go to hell, and that women should be kept at home and not allowed to work outside. This is the kind of extraordinary extremist view that he holds. But Amy Goodman just gives him a free pass, doesn't ask him about any of those things, and then just repeats all of his lies. And then this becomes part of the progressive discourse as well. So, they simply acted as relay stations for State Department propaganda. Nobody has been able to point to a single body in the quote unquote Xinjiang genocide, as opposed to Palestine, which you see is an ongoing atrocity, an ongoing genocide. You can see the bodies every single day, children starving, amputated, killed every single day, babies dying, and at the same time, the US has the audacity to claim that this is not a genocide, and that what's happening in Xinjiang, which is a program of development and benefit, is some kind of genocide. We're living in an insane world, a crazy upside down world. And anybody who believes these lies, you have to understand, is either shilling as a propagandist, or is completely out of their minds. That said, the Chinese have said for a very, very long time that the US has been trying to radicalize the Uyghurs in Xinjiang to create a theocratic state inside of China. Now, China is a multi-ethnic state. There are 55 ethnic minorities. All of them have equal consideration under Chinese law. They all own land. They all have additional privileges. They all have legislative representation. Even the smallest ethnic minorities. Some of these ethnic minorities, excuse me, are 2,000 or 3,000 people, and still they have legislative representation at the highest, at the People's Congress. And so there's a kind of extraordinary, program of inclusion and representation that China represents. And China does not have a history of repressing its ethnic minorities. Certainly the PRC doesn't do that. How do I know that? Because I am a Korean, and Koreans are an ethnic minority in China. If you go to the Korean parts of China, you'll see that Korean culture is perfectly preserved. People live, good lives. They feel both Chinese and secure in their own cultural traditions. As opposed to anywhere else in the world. You go to Japan as a Korean, Koreans in Japan will not tell you that they are Korean. They will hide their identity, because being Korean in Japan is worse than being Black in the United States. I kid you not.
Really?
I kid you not. Yes, I kid you not. Yes.
See, I don't know the racial dynamics in these various countries, right? So I'm always fascinated to hear like a minority experience in a different country, like meeting, like you said, a Korean in Japan, or a Black person in Japan, or whatever, religious makeup that the person has in a particular country, and how that country regards that person. It's fascinating. I didn't know that it was that way, that extreme.
Let me give you one more example, Jamal. The ethnic minorities are 8% of China's population. They're 8% of China's population, and they possess 45% of China's land, territory, mostly in autonomous regions. Okay, so that is a figure that you will never find in any other country with ethnic minorities. Most countries with ethnic minorities, the ethnic minorities are marginalized and don't have anything. But China has been working on this notion of inclusion and diversity for many millennia. It's a multi-ethnic civilizational state, and it has many flaws. But one of the things that it seems to have figured out is how to create a multi-ethnic, multi-religious state without one group dominating or one group erasing the other groups. And the way that it does that is it has built a meritocratic society. For about 2,000 years, China's been meritocratic, which means to say that, you understand that everybody and every group has brilliant people, and you support them to reach the highest levels of political office and political power. And they've done this for thousands of years. So essentially, in that sense, they understand the value of each and every minority. And at the same time, they had a secular government, once again, for thousands of years that did not interfere with religion. So you had Islamists and Buddhists and Taoists, all held under this large umbrella of a secular state that was nominally Confucian. Confucianism is largely a secular religion. So, for example, let's think about the Jewish diaspora, when they first arrived in China, probably around the 7th, 8th century, they settled around the 10th century. They had a meeting with the Chinese emperor. And the Chinese emperor said to, to the Jews who were, starting to settle in China, he said, you have to make a promise to me. You have to make sure that you respect and uphold the traditions of your ancestors. If you do that, you are welcome in China. In other words, if you continue to be Jewish, you have a place in China. Okay. And same thing for Islam. And you see this again and again. This comes out of, a philosophical tradition called Mohism, Mohism. But the Mohis believe that essentially what you want is a kind of universal tolerance, a universal love that, under the sky, all people are family. This is, kind of one of the foundational beliefs in Chinese culture, which is why it was able to create a civilizational state that was multi-ethnic and multi-religious. So all of this doesn't make any sense from a Chinese historical standpoint. But remember, the Chinese said that, have been alleging that the US has been trying to peel off and weaponize small elements of the Muslims in Xinjiang and weaponize them against the Chinese state. And the West has said, oh, no, that's all, BS. The Chinese are just making that up. They're just, quote, using this terror discourse in order to oppress people gratuitously because they're racist Fs, right? And then now you see that, you have these TIP, ETIM militants who have said that we're going to go back to China and create a theocratic ethnostate inside it. We are Salafists, we are Takfiri Salafists. We're going to wipe out not only all the Han Chinese, but any Islamic tradition, which is not Salafist. So this is the threat. And we know that this has been the case because the US has done this over and over again. It did this with Afghan jihadis. Right. It did this against Russia. It did this in, the Islamic fundamentalists were weaponized all over the world, in the Middle East, in Indonesia, in the Philippines, everywhere, against radical nationalist liberation movements, against progressive socialist movements. This has been the bull.
I'm sorry, South America. South America. You're right. It's all over the world. Ukrainians, who did they use? Hardcore right-wingers, Nazis for all intents and purposes. Right. If you look at South America, they used kill squads in order to go and attack the Sandinista governments because they didn't like the Sandinista governments, that they were to the left. It's all over the world. Syria, for God's sake, Libya, for God's sake.
And same thing, Siebel Edwards and Lawrence Wilkerson have pointed out, they've kind of spilled the beans that this was a US plan. The Chinese were not, pulling this out of their rear end. The allegations that the Chinese were making about the Uyghurs creating, terror threats on Chinese soil were real, and that they acknowledged that the US was behind them. So Siebel Edmonds, going back to the early 2000s, and Lawrence Wilkerson said, we are in Afghanistan because we want to be able to use the Uyghurs against China to create trouble for China, as we did for the Soviet Union through Afghanistan, etc. This is a clear and distinct plan. And now the US, after having stonewalled and denied and said that this is a Chinese fantasy, we see that this is actually the case. And the Uyghur fighters have said that we are going to go back to China and sow terror, and we're going to destroy, China and create our own ethno-state. So all of this validates the Chinese position. So then the next question is, are the Chinese worried about this? I would say yes and no. On the one hand, Xinjiang is pretty stable. Okay, so they've created a stable place. US is still trying to destabilize it, because one of the things that China did in order to stabilize Xinjiang was to create massive economic development, vocational training plans, economic development, etc. And by doing this, they were able, to prevent the conditions that result in terrorism. I mean, terrorism it flourishes under the conditions of poverty and economic deprivation. And so, if everybody is happy and if society is well developed, then nobody has a reason to fall back into these extremist beliefs. By the way, China traditionally does not have a tradition of Salafist thought. This is Western Wahhabi Salafist Takfiri thought is very much U.S. Saudi Arabia created trend or promoted trend. China has an indigenous tradition of Islam, which goes back over 1,000 years, and originally was largely Sufi. There are 4 traditional schools of Sufism that are actually indigenous Chinese. And so Islam is actually an inherent and large part of Chinese culture itself, as much as Buddhism, as much as Taoism is. But anyway, the US wants to weaponize these ETIM radicals against China. Does it pose a direct threat? Probably not so much in the current moment, although the US is continuing to try to reduce Xinjiang's economic development. That's why they're putting out all these, allegations of slave labor. Anything that comes from Xinjiang, cotton or tomatoes or a polysilicon, we automatically assume that it is caused by slave labor. And the reason for that is to destroy all the industries in Xinjiang, of which cotton and tomatoes produce and polysilicon are important parts. And the idea is if you destroy the industry, then everybody will be unemployed and they'll resort back to, it'll be another breeding ground for discontent. Right. So this is, extraordinarily cynical because they say they're trying to prevent Uyghurs, but they're actually trying to weaponize them and create more discontent and create suffering in order to weaponize them. But I don't think Xinjiang, for the current moment, is an immediate threat because it's a long distance from Syria to Xinjiang. But what I do anticipate happening will be an escalation on attacks on the Belt and Road projects that go through Central Asia and to Africa and towards Europe. I think terroristic attacks on those will increase, as we have already seen, for example, in Balochistan in Pakistan, where Chinese engineers are routinely killed, Chinese teachers are routinely killed. Anybody working on these Belt and Road projects is just, I think a few months ago, they took a whole bunch of barbers, people cutting hair, and they killed all of them simply because they were working for the project. Why would you kill barbers? Why would you kill day laborers? Ordinary laborers. But this is the kind of terrorism that I anticipate will continue to escalate as we see, as these kind of extremist militants spread out and gain more and more purchase.
Yeah, we have, man. I mean, I can't argue with what you're saying, right? I mean, the reality of it is we did pay those terrorists. We were supporting those terrorists. We've been paying them and supporting them going all the way back to the George Bush administration, if not before. Colonel Wilkerson, when he was on the show, he pointed out before the George Bush administration, we were backing and supporting those terrorists in that region. And if indeed we were backing the people who invaded and destroyed Syria as we know it, some of those people were Uyghurs, right? So it's not necessarily conjecture. It is just somewhat of a flat fact. KJ, always appreciate you, man. I wanted to get you in before the end of the year because, again, I've been trying to bring the friends of the show to close the year and to open the year. And I really appreciate it, man. You have a fantastic New Year's.
Thank you. You too. Always a pleasure.
Oh, by the way, Wandering Earth, before it closes, the same guy who made Dark Forest, who made Three Body, Shi Luo. I'm butchering his name. It is Sixen Lao. That's the name. One of the things that shows up in those books has to do with this long arc of history. in a way that Americans don't really think about in that way. Like the notion that you have a government that lasts for thousands of years, or that you have a continuity of government for thousands of years. And many of the things in his book deal with that, whether it's Wandering Earth, where you have a similar government that's able to stay in place, meaning political party that is able to carry out something for thousands of years. I mean, granted, it's fanciful. You're attacking boosters to Earth and moving it away to a new sun. But whatever. But the book is fantastic. Oh, at the very least, I like that particular story in the book. And even in Three Body, it's something of government going on for hundreds of years with a certain political continuity. It's something about the way he writes that book that has, God, man, it's hard to explain to American audience. But when you read it, it comes across differently in the way that they think about the world and think about political continuity. It's just fascinating. If you get the chance, read it. I would be super curious about your take on the beginning chapters of Three Body, where they're talking about the Maoist revolution and everything else. But man, thank you for this. I really appreciate you, KJ. Thank you, man, and everything you've done for the show. All of these, you have been a friend of the show going back to Radio Sputnik time, and you have continued with your continuity here. And I really appreciate you, man. Thank you for this.
My pleasure, and thank you for your fantastic work. It's such an invaluable service to everybody who's, really wanting to hear real news.
I am a humble servant of my audience. Thank you, man. KJ No, he's a journalist, political analyst, writer, and teacher specializing in the geopolitics of the Asia Pacific region. He's a contributor to the book Capitalism on a Ventilator. Once censored by Amazon, it is now available at iacenter.org. You have a good year, KJ. I'll see you in a few, man. Have a good one. I'll see you next year. All right. We have come